Make sure it's recording, starting promptly at 7:30. So this is the last shiur in this particular series of Halacha, the system and development of Halacha. Please God, next Monday, I'll obviously send out information, hopefully timelessly, just about something related to Pesach. I'm not sure if yet it'll be over the one Monday or over two. Probably because we've got 2 Mondays, I'll try to think of something that we can do over the next 2 Mondays leading up to Pesach, please God. Can we just share the screen? Okay, so what I wanted to end off with, and again, there's so much, probably more that could have been said on this entire subject, but I guess we had to limit it somewhere, is that we've spoken about the written Torah, we've spoken about the oral law, we've spoken about a certainty in halacha. The obvious question is, well, if there is that certainty from the written Torah and from the oral Torah through the passing down through the generations, well, how does the idea of machloket, dispute, fit into the whole picture of what we said before this? In the previous shurim, what is the place and how do we understand machloket, dispute in halacha? Okay, so as I've put there, halachic disputes arose due to the enormous persecution that arose during and after the Second Temple. So just before the destruction and obviously thereafter, obviously it was the difficulty of the times that prevented the scholars from studying Torah properly, and they didn't have the time to sufficiently serve their teachers. So that led to the onset of disputes, which we didn't have previous to the Second Temple period, just before the destruction and after. But again, we still need to understand, okay, fine, we've now got disputes that arise, but what is the nature of these disputes? Are we talking about fundamental issues of Judaism, of halacha being debated, being disputed? Are we talking about core beliefs, core practices? And the answer is no. So the dispute is really in the details. Anyone who's just has even a passing knowledge of the Gemara, the Talmud, knows that the scholars, the sages in the Talmud, didn't disagree over Jewish belief and practice and fundamentals. They were really just debating and disputing details, small details of the mitzvot, never the identity of the mitzvot themselves, and never fundamentals of the actual Jewish religion. Regarding all major issues, all major halachot, all major fundamental Jewish beliefs, there was absolute complete consensus from the time of Sinai up until present date. I've put over here just a little bit about what Ramban, Maimonides, writes in his introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah. And he again says that disputes, just put in summary, disputes concern the details of the laws only. So Ramban, Maimonides, goes further on to say that the sages never disputed the basic identity of any mitzvah. Again, it was about the details. They received the tradition of the basic mitzvot from their teachers, but as I said earlier, since they didn't attend the teachers sufficiently, their minds were preoccupied. There were times now of persecution. They didn't have the sufficient time. They didn't ask the teachers to explain the details more fully. Again, so no one ever debated or disputed the fact that there was a law to light Shabbos candles in honor of the Shabbos. But now what came about is dispute about what materials, what types of substance can be used as the candles for the Shabbos light, the oils, etc. No one ever argued if there was an obligation to recite the Shema every morning and every night. But now what came up was just the minutiae, the details about what's the earliest time in the morning that one can fulfill this mitzvah, what's the latest period at night. And again, it wasn't that. I've just given those 2 examples, but that would apply to all the discussions and all the, in inverted commas, disputes about these issues of application of the mitzvot. The mitzvot themselves were never in dispute. I've put that over there. Matters of dispute were never themselves subject of the dispute. And when I say matters of tradition, if we could think back to the previous shiurim that I gave, this would refer to the explanations that Moshe was given directly by Hashem to interpret various verses in the Torah itself, and also regarding those laws that we know as Halacha leMoshe miSinai. Again, just to jog your memories, that was something that's not even referenced in the Torah text, but God taught it to Moshe new, and that was passed down. So regarding those, there's absolutely no dispute regarding that. We never have any halachic disputes about that sort of tradition. But any law that came about through reasoning, we spoke about the interpretation of interpretive rules of interpreting the Torah, the so-called Talmudic logic. There you obviously had the potential for debate and a potential for disputes. But again, and I just need to emphasize that the disputes in these areas focus only on the details. They were never about the mitzvot themselves, never ever about fundamental Jewish practice. Again, so if I take an example that what I spoke about in a previous shiur, so there would never, for example, be a dispute that speaking about Sukkot, taking the pre-Eitz Hadar referred to the etrog. No one ever disputes that. In any Talmudic halachic literature, you'll never find a dispute saying, no, I actually disagree. It wasn't the citron, it was actually a lemon, it was actually a banana. Everyone absolutely agrees that it was an etrog. The other thing that's important to realize, I'll just put there part C for heaven's sake. I should say that slower, for heaven's sake, not for heaven's sake, but for heaven's sake. That Talmudic and rabbinic disputes were never motivated out of self-interest. So you never had one rabbi arguing about the other rabbi because he wanted one up on that particular individual. Never for the cover, never for the person's own glory. It was only for the motivation to really get to what the ultimate truth is. And again, many of you are familiar with this that I've put over here, the chapter 5, Mishnah 17 in Ethics of the Fathers. And it reads as follows: any dispute argued for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. One that is argued for a purpose other than the sake of heaven is not destined to endure. And the Mishnah asks, what is a prime example of a dispute argued for the sake of heaven? The answer given is a dispute between Hillel and Shammai. So again, when we speak about for the sake of heaven, it refers to obtaining, establishing truth without any personal motives, without any personal objectives. When you speak about the houses of Hillel and Shammai, they're not motivated by pride. There was no ulterior motive. It was really just coming to to establish what ultimately was Hashem's will, what ultimately is the truth. And we actually find this. We find this that there's a Gemara. I can't remember the exact source of it now, but hopefully you'll take my word for it. That when Hillel and Shammai's positions in debate were actually rejected in favor of a third party. So in other words, it wasn't found in favor of Hillel or Shammai. We actually find that they then ultimately agree with a third opinion, which leads to the next question: is that if ultimately we have a conclusion, we have a halachic decision, then why do we even mention the dissenting views at all? We know that according to the Gemara, Hillel and Shammai did not persist in their views once it had clearly been adopted a third opinion. And that comes to section 2, what I've said over here, which is both sides are right. So let me explain that a bit more fully. Is that when we study the Torah and when we discuss any dispute in halacha, every word of the discussion, so not just what we come to, not just the very last verse, yes or no, kosher, not kosher. Every part of that discussion is deemed part of the act of Talmud Torah, the act of the mitzvah of learning Torah, both the correct outcome and even those that were deemed not to be correct. And in the words, in the lashon, in the words of the expression of the Gemara, it says elu ve'elu, these and these, divrei Elokim chayim. They're all words of the living God. So even the dissenting view, the view which ultimately isn't taken to be halacha as we practice it, is considered Torah, is considered the words divrei Elokim chayim, the words of the living God. When we find application of this particular rule, where we say elu ve'elu, both the winner, so to speak, and the loser, so to speak, are still mentioned. They're both equally valid parts of Torah. So here we have a source in Eruvin in the Gemara. It says, Rabbi Abba stated in the name of Shmuel, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were in dispute, with each claiming that the halacha is as they posited. Then a heavenly voice announced both opinions are the words of the living God. But in practice, the halacha follows the opinion of Beit Hillel. Which brings us to the concept of procedure versus practice. So, okay, sounds all very great, sounds all very Pollyanna. We don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And yes, the halacha might be according to X, but why are you still right? It's almost like patting that person that came last in the race. You know, you ran a good race, you did your best. Is that what it's about? No. It's about procedure versus practice. If we say that all or both of them are right, let's say we've got a dispute between two. How are they both right if in practice we follow the one? That's halacha. Halacha is X. How can we then say X and Y are both right? So the truth is we're dealing with two separate entities. One being, as I've put there, is the procedure. Let's call it the legal procedure of halacha, by which halachic rulings are made. And when you say that, we say as far as that's concerned, Beit Hillel, let's take the example of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, both were absolutely correct. Both had sound methodology, sound reasoning based on principles that were taught by their teachers going back, their yeshivot dating back all the way to Sinai. And we know that their motives, as I said a little bit earlier, were absolutely selfless. They were only trying to find the ultimate truth, what ultimately was God's will. So the legal procedure is valid, and in that way, it's absolutely correct Torah. Then we have to have, at the end of the day, a practical law. When it comes to deciding how the Jewish people should observe a particular practice, we have to have uniformity in practice. That's of utmost importance. I don't want to digress too much. Yes, we can have a different minhag of applying the halacha, but at the core, the halacha has to be uniform throughout Jewry, whether the Jew is in Johannesburg or whether the Jew is in Lisbon, Portugal. It has to be the same halacha. So that's the difference between the legal procedure or process and ultimately the practice, if we have to have uniform halacha. And the beauty and the complexity of Torah is that it allowed for the possibility of opposing and even sometimes contradictory views. Again, so I want to stress this again. Everything had been taught to Moshe at Sinai. Certain details were left for the scholars of later generations to determine the actual practice. But you can certainly have dissenting views. All of them are absolutely correct because they're using sound methodology, but you have to then have a clear and discernible halacha. I just had a passage over here just to show you. This comes from the Chidushei Haritva. So he actually speaks on this particular part of Gemara here, that I said that this bas call, this voice from God, so to speak, came and said that both views of the words of the living Torah. So look what the Chidushei Haritva says on this. He says that the French rabbis asked, how could both opinions be the words of the living God, where one permits the same thing that the other prohibits? Okay, so here we're talking about complete contradictory views. They answered that when Moshe ascended to heaven to receive the Torah, God showed him regarding every matter 49 ways to conclude that the halacha prohibits, and 49 ways to conclude that the halacha permits. Moshe obviously asked about this, and Hashem answered that the sages of Israel in each generation would be authorized to decide, and their ruling would be binding. Important. If we go on now to the other, let me just scroll down on the page, the other paragraph that I've got here from Rabbeinu Nissim, often known by his shorter acronym, the RAN, very famous of the Rishonim, the early codifiers. So he goes on to say, I didn't want to cut this short. I wanted to give you the full extracts. I'll read this with you. It says, what this concept means is that the entire written Torah and the oral Torah were transmitted to Moshe, and he quotes from the Gemara in Megillah. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, what is meant by the verse, and in Hebrew it says, Va'aleihem kachol hadvarim. This is actually referring to the luchot, the tablets, and it says on those tablets is written kachol hadvarim, everything, all the words. Gives the reference in Deuteronomy 9:10. This teaches us that God showed Moshe what is to be derived from any extra words in the written Torah, and what is to be derived from the words of the Mishnah. And here's the interesting part. And even those things that the sages would institute in the future, such as the reading of the Megillah. The term, what is to derive from the words of the Mishnah, refers to the disputes among the sages and the opposing lines of reason maintained by the wise men of Israel. Moshe learned the details of each dispute from God, but not the final decision. Okay, and that's important. Instead, Hashem taught him the principle by which to determine the truth, which is, and again, this is a law that we have from the book of Shemot, that acharei rabim lahatos, the majority opinion prevails. We also have the law which says, do not veer from the ruling that they tell you. When disputes later arose among the sages, and it was one person against many, they would decide the halacha according to the majority opinion, just like Torah says. When one group disputed another group, or one individual disputed another, the matter was decided by the sages of the generation. The authority was bestowed upon them, as the verse states, and here we've got another scriptural verse. You shall go to the Kohen from the tribe of Levi, or the judge who will preside in those days. And again, the other verse, do not veer from what they tell you. He ends to say that the run ends, we see that the sage of the generations have been authorized to render decision whenever some dispute the halacha according to what is correct in their eyes. Okay, so if I can try to summarize that. I know there was a lot to read, to go through together, but Hashem taught Moshe the principles of the oral Torah that we know already. God knew that disputes would arise in the future when the sages would use this oral law, the authentic Torah, and the methodology that was handed down to Moses at Sinai, according to their opinions. When Moshe went to receive the Torah, this is an interesting part. Listen to this. God, as we read it there from the words of the Ran, God prophetically showed him all the opinions of all the sages that would come forward in the future. And again, I want to stress this. It's not to be confused here that formed part of the oral law. No, that's not the oral law that Moshe passed down by generation to generation. But at the same time that Moshe was taught the oral law, he was also explained all the various scenarios, all the various disputes that may arise in the future from subsequent generations, subsequent leaders of generations. And of course, the reasoning, we have the oral law that's passed down, but that reasoning, that rationale, that decision making was left to future generations. I put your point 3, while both sides of a dispute express truth and have potential to be established as halacha, also a very important point is, the God-given guidelines for establishing the halacha trump the higher level truth of heaven. I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to give an example. Where we have established rules for coming to halacha, even if theoretically a voice would call down from heaven to say, no, you've got it wrong, this is a higher level of truth. Nevertheless, we'd go according to the ways of how the methodology for halacha being established. So I want to show you over here what we learn out from another Gemara, where again the summary is the rules of halacha override the heavenly voice. But let me read this piece of Gemara. It's fascinating. It has been taught, listen to this, on that day Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. So here you've got a scenario. Rabbi Eliezer is trying to get his point across. He really believes he's absolutely correct, and they're just not buying it. They're not going according to what he says. So Rabbi Eliezer says to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Gemara relates that the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Others affirm it was 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, all the other sages retorted. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. What happened afterwards was the water flowed backwards. Again, those dissenting sages said no proof can be brought from a stream of water. Again, this Rabbi Eliezer, he doesn't want to be deterred. He says, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it. Whereupon the Gemara tells us that the walls inclined to fall. But Rabbi Yeshua, he was one of the dissenting rabbis, rebuked them, saying, when scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute, what have you to interfere? This is Rabbi Yeshua now, just to give you the context, speaking to the walls. Okay, speaking to the walls. Why are you collapsing? We are halachic stages, we're disputing. What do you have to get involved here? And the walls didn't fall in honor of Rabbi Yeshua, but they also didn't stand upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, who asked for them to lean inwards. And they are still standing inclined. The important thing here, again, he said to them, this is Rabbi Eliezer, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, why do you dispute Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? You've got to come out. A voice is coming from heaven saying, guys, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. Listen to this. Rabbi Yeshua nevertheless arose and he exclaimed, and he used a verse from Devarim, from the book of Devarim, that Torah loi bashamayim hi. Torah is no longer in the heaven. What did he mean by this? We pay no attention to a heavenly voice because you referring to Hashem, have long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai that a case must be decided on the basis of majority. Now we've got a Torah. Hashem, you've given us the Torah. The Torah says, Lo bashamayim, Torah is no longer in heaven. You've given us your own rules, God, to determine halacha. It goes according to the majority. So now we have to go by your own rules that you write in your Torah. Here comes a fascinating end to this story. Rabbi Natan met Elijah the prophet and asked him, what did God do in that hour? So after this happened, after this heavenly voice came out, and nevertheless, Rabbi Yeshua said, we can't listen to you. What did God do at that moment? Elijah the prophet was asked. Elijah the prophet replied, he, meaning God, laughed. He laughed with joy, saying, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. In other words, not from a point of view that, oh, what are they doing? But no, I'm actually got nachas. I'm proud of what they're doing. I've given them laws. I've given them systems, and they're applying them. It's almost as if God is, it's almost like the story when the student surpasses the master. Of course, that can't be the case when we're speaking about God. But God is getting nachas, so to speak, from a student mastering that which the teacher has been able to teach the student, that being the process of halachic determination. Okay, the next thing I've got there is assembling the puzzle. What I mean by that is the process, the methodology of coming to a halachic decision, as we've already seen, past shiurim is a complicated process. It involves many different pieces of information, different and often competing lines of logic. We've learned about the interpretive rules that have to be followed, legal precedents that have to be adhered to and accounted for. And obviously, taking all this into account, it's unsurprising that different scholars would somehow put those pieces together in a different way. So listen to what Ramban, this is now Nachmanides, says. He says, anyone who studies our Talmud is aware that when the commentators dispute its interpretation, there are no absolute proofs or unanswered challenges. Indeed, this discipline does not allow for concrete axiomatic facts as there are in mathematics or geometry. We apply all our faculties to demonstrate through sound logic and by showing its difficulties in the existing Talmudic text that one of the opinions is unlikely to be correct. We then support the opposing opinion by showing that it fits in well with the text of the Talmud's passages and that it is valid. This is as much as we are capable of. That's what Maimonides writes. If we think about it, possibly the best way, and just keeping what I've said over here, assembling the puzzle, is taking the analogy, taking an example of a jigsaw puzzle. So you open up a box of a jigsaw puzzle and all the jigsaw puzzles come falling out, tumbling out. They've all got different sizes, different colors, all irregular shaped pieces. Even without being told how the pieces are supposed to be arranged. And even if you don't have that box, you've got the picture of the puppy in the meadow. We don't have the box to know what this puzzle is supposed to look like. Any skilled puzzle-making expert will be able to arrange the pieces to reproduce it. And this is similar when it comes to arranging, so to speak, what was Hashem's original will? What was the original application of this particular mitzvah? So again, if I just apply that analogy a bit further to include what we're speaking about now, about machloket, about disputes. So again, imagine that several experts, besides not having seen the original picture of what that puzzle is supposed to look like, are given pieces which, by being arranged in various ways, are capable of producing different, but nevertheless fairly coherent images. Now, if you complicate this even further with the suggestions that some of the pieces may be missing, and that some pieces, regardless of the arrangement, may interlock only with difficulty. You've always tried to do that puzzle. You try, geez, this really must fit. You try and squash it in to fit. So similarly, when you've got the assemblers of this analogous puzzle that you're trying to put together, they may be forced to create fits where maybe fits weren't supposed to be. So maybe less than a perfect fit, but I'm somehow going to be able to make this jigsaw piece fit into that jigsaw piece, and I'll still come out with a picture. The expert's only guide is that the picture with the least objectionable fault would probably be the closest to the original one. And that's typically what we have in the Gemara. When we go back and forth with the Gemara, we've got the picture. We know what the puzzle is supposed to look like. Is it going to be green grass? Is it going to be yellow and orange grass? Is it autumnal grass? Is it spring grass? Is it winter grass? That we're not so sure about. Ultimately comes which puzzle looks the best, which puzzle has at the least amount of having to manipulate the piece, having to fill in a piece where there wasn't a piece over there. But again, I need to stress this, we're not talking about putting a piece into the puzzle that changes totally the picture and the intention of the fundamental laws, the fundamental mitzvot. We're just looking at, as I said, the example, we know we have to say Shema in the morning and the night. What's the earliest time? Is it this time? Is it dawn? Is it when the sunrise? What are the halachic parameters? And that's an analogy of assembling a puzzle. Okay, part D, and I'm almost near the end of this. Nothing but the truth. What I mean, I said a little bit earlier that absolute proof is rare when we deal with halacha. Again, the Rabbi Nissim said we're not talking about maths, about formula that are absolutely black and white. The possibility of having different opinions is almost inevitable, one could say. But again, this doesn't mean that just anyone can decide his own interpretations and consider them that being a valid choice, and that's now halacha. You need to understand that when we speak about the rabbis and the sages of the Talmud, these individuals were chosen specifically. They were authorized for their positions by their mentors. If you recall, we spoke last week about the system of smicha, where the person had to show absolute proficiency in whatever the previous Rebbe, the previous head of the yeshiva had taught. Before we could allow the other person to be pass on to the next generation, you have to be absolutely proficient. So these Talmudic sages, the ones we talk about who dispute one with the other, they have the most integrity in how they formulate halachic rulings. So when you speak about their words being the words of the living Torah, the living God, absolutely, it makes absolute sense. Okay, we also need to understand that going back in history, as long as we had the Sanhedrin, the great Jewish court, as long as that existed, we didn't, well, there were debates, but the debates were resolved really, really swiftly. These so-called disputes in the minutiae of Torah practice and mitzvot. With the case of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the houses of Hillel and Shammai, they continued to debate their differences for a period of 3 years. So these arguments going back and forth actually occurred for a period of 3 years. I've given over here the excerpt from Rabbi Shol Salanta. He was the great rabbi, the great leader of the Musar movement. And he says like this: the dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai was about measuring the superiority of each other's proofs. Each side understood well all the proofs offered regarding their points of dispute. A super dispute then arose regarding how to decide their disagreements, whether according to the majority of voices or according to the side with greater intellectual capacity. Their 3-year argument was not because they were stubbornly refusing to give in. And as you said before, there was no ulterior motive. Rather, they argued for the sake of justice and truth with pure intentions. It turned out that they argued for 3 years, with Beit Shammai assuming that they had the superior position, while Beit Hillel assumed they had the superior position. This might be why, says Yisrael Salanta, why the heavenly voice called out, saying both opinions are the words of the living Torah. The idea that even the rejected opinion is also called Torah was not new. The idea that the Torah is no longer in heaven was definitely taught to Moshe from Sinai. It had not been forgotten. I spoke briefly about that earlier. The purpose of the appearance of this heavenly voice was to give encouragement to the people after seeing the unprecedented 3-year dispute. So again, let me just put parentheses here. I said earlier, we've got Torah here. Torah is not in heaven. Torah is now by the hands of man. We partners with Hashem in making halacha. So why now do we heed the heavenly voice? Okay, this heavenly voice wasn't here to decide halacha. Listen to what this heavenly voice is saying. The purpose of the appearance of this heavenly voice was to give encouragement to the people after seeing the unprecedented 3-year dispute. They might have entertained the thought that the scholars no longer had pure intentions and that they were standing up for their own honor. If so, the opinions would not be the kind that God desires to be transmitted as Torah and called God's Torah, even when rejected in practice. Therefore, the heavenly voice reassured the people that each side genuinely searched for the truth, even though they carried on the dispute for so long. Therefore, even the rejected words of Beit Shammai were still the words of the living God, and someone studying them is studying God's Torah. That forms part, as I said earlier, the mitzvah of learning Torah, learning about the disputes, learning about even those whose opinion at the end of the day is not held to be the actual practical halacha. Okay, this is a very, very last section, a very short section that I wanted to end off on is the framework of machloket in contemporary halacha. Contemporary halacha. So again, we need to understand, we speak about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disputes going on for a period of 3 years. Even when this heavenly voice came out, that wasn't the end of disputes, obviously. Throughout halachic literature, we find disputes among major authorities regarding rulings of their predecessors. And again, even though this is done with great respect, tremendous respect for those that came before, nevertheless, we have a rule that a poisek, someone who, and I've got this in point number 1, the poisek must apply. A poisek is someone who determines halachic law, must apply his own scholarship to the words of the living God to determine the law correctly. He's got to have his own eyes. He's got to be able to see with his own eyes. He must apply, so to speak, his own chokhmah. So again, it's important to stress that we obviously acknowledge that the early scholars, I've said this so many times in Shiurim at Shul, that the closer the generation was to Sinai, the greater obviously they certainly were. So obviously contemporary scholars are certainly of a lesser standing than those earlier ones. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that we argue with their ideas, and sometimes we refute the issues. And in fact, our criticism may in fact be correct. Okay, that obviously sounds ludicrous. So how can that be? So again, you've heard this analogy from me as well. Who can see further, a giant or a dwarf? Obviously, you'd say the giant. If you've got a wall, and who can see further over the wall? The giant's going to see over the wall. The dwarf can't see. But now, if you put the dwarf on the shoulder of the giant, the dwarf can see so much more, can see so much higher. It's got a much higher vantage point than the giant, and that's what we are. That's what the subsequent generations are. They're standing on the knowledge. They're standing on all the chokhmah, all the wisdom of their earlier counterparts. But now it's the dwarf who's seeing. Ultimately, the dwarf is the one who must be able to apply something according to what he sees, and he's possibly seeing a bit more because he's using his eyes now, plus leaning on and leveraging the learnings and the wisdom of those giants that came before. Again, in parentheses as well, I want to just say it over here as well. That's why, how can we say that we're deserving of Mashiach? That this is a generation of Mashiach's going to come. What do you mean? What about the previous generations? The great. What about the generation of the Mishnah, the Gemara? Again, the same concept. It's a dwarf on giant shoulders. We're leveraging, we're using all their zchuyot, all their merits, that we're on their shoulders. We're going on their shoulders. They're allowing us that leverage. And so we could please God merit. Like I said, that's just in parentheses. Look what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says. I haven't given the text, but I'll read you the text. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who does go we still obviously consider him a contemporary posek, a contemporary decider of Jewish law. He says it's correct and obligatory for the sages of later generations, and that obviously included himself, to decide halacha, even if they are not qualified according to the standards of the Talmudic sages. Therefore, it is valid to be concerned that the halachic determinations are not in accord with the view of heaven. Interesting. They're not on the same level, so there may be a concern that they're not in accord with the view of heaven. Now listen to what Moshe says. However, in truth, we are guided by the principle, as I mentioned it earlier, that Torah is not in heaven. Rather, it is determined according to what appears correct to the rabbi after proper study of the issue, to clarify the halacha according to the Gemara and the writings of those earlier decision makers, the poskim. He is to use his full abilities, his serious deliberation, and his fear of heaven in order to determine what appears to be the correct halacha. Such a ruling is viewed as true, and he is obligated to issue his conclusion. This obligation exists even if in fact his ruling is contrary to the halacha in heaven. Amazing. I said before, even if theoretically there would be a voice that came out and said, Reb Moshe, you've got this wrong. No, God, you've given me permission. Not only permission, you've given me the instruction, the authorization to do this. And such, let's use Reb Moshe Feinstein as an example again. All of these rulings would be considered the rulings and the Torah, the word of the living God. And again, that's absolutely so important to bear in mind. Again, it comes from the idea, I put it over here, you must observe all that they decide for you. Again, we have that verse, that pasuk in Devarim, that you shall come to a judge who will judge you in those days. Now, interesting enough, the Torah itself in those verses realizes there's going to be subsequent days, there are going to be future days. Don't rely on judges of future generations. Bring it to the judge that is going to judge in that case. We also need to realize that in every generation, even though what I said before, that we may not be as great, certainly it's unequivocal that we're not as great as previous generations. But from that verse again, you must observe all that they decide for you. related in the bygone days to the Sanhedrin, but applies equally today for any religious leader. And again, when I talk about religious leader, it's not coming to a Rodney and asking to now codify and make a new halachic determination. Absolutely not. It's got to be someone, and there are, thank God, many today, great poskim. Even our own Beis Din, it's important to know this, our own Beis Din doesn't just come up with halachic rulings based on their own determinations. They take counsel from the prevailing leaders, decision makers today around the world, be it in the States, be it in Israel. And there are many leading poskim today. I just want to end with one idea. This is point 4. And it's also so important to understand, why is it that we don't judge we don't give the rulings from previous poskim. We need to look at times how they are today. As I put point 4, only the contemporary sage can understand all the unique variables relevant to his situation. You can't go and say, well, what was 200 years ago? 200 years ago, it was a very different society to what it is today. And again, for those who maybe came to the Shiur late, I'm not here talking about any fundamental Jewish practice, any fundamental core mitzvot. Here we talk about the minutiae, the application of halacha, and possibly in our times, we're talking about the application to changing technology, even, let's say, to COVID. We've seen so many applications today, COVID. Again, they would have gone back to see how was this done when there were previous plagues, previous outbreaks, Black Plague, etc. What did we do for a minyan? What do we do for mitzvot, etc.? Certainly precedent, but even with precedent, we need to look at circumstances as they exist at the moment. Where do we find this? This point 4. I just want to end where we actually find Tanakh. We find scriptural support for this idea of contemporary sage having to understand the variables at the time. So there's a Gemara, there's a part of a Gemara in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, which says that Yiftach was one of the early judges. It says Yiftach could judge in his generation as Shmuel. Shmuel was a judge. He was also the first of the prophets, as we call in the book of prophets, Shmuel Aleph, etc. So Yiftach could judge in his generation as Shmuel could judge in his time. Okay, that sounds great. What's so special about that? We need to understand that Yiftach judged. He lived 100 years before Shmuel. And we're going to have a number of generations that would have passed between Yiftach and Shmuel. Nevertheless, what the Gemara is saying, don't rely on the judgments, the proclamations by Yiftach. You need to now bring matters to Shmuel. Shmuel is the judge at the time. You need to go to him, and we need to understand that in all subsequent generations, our generation, all the people, all the poskim, who give piskei halacha, who give decisions on all areas of law, do so as part of the living Torah. And in fact, they add to the body of Torah. So we always speak about a living Torah. Yes, we know that the Tanakh was codified. The canon as we know it, Megillat Esther, was the last of the writings. We know that when the Gemara was redacted, that's the end of the oral law. We don't have any more oral law being innovated, so to speak, or being pronounced upon. We no longer are able to use the 13 principles of elucidation, 13 principles of deduction, of reasoning, of logic. But nevertheless, Torah still develops, Torah still expands. All what we call today a chidush, a novel idea. Someone comes up with a new interpretation of a verse in Chumash, doesn't for one moment mean that he's interpreted that, I don't know, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt and now he's coming with something absolutely different. No, but he's giving a new angle on that. That becomes part of the body of Torah that constantly expands, that constantly grows, and all of that is always, please God, going to grow and always going to expand. Just want to end very briefly with this. I'll just go through in point form, just to summarize what we did in the Shiur. So we started with, why did the sages in the Talmud have so many disputes? So hopefully we answered that the sages of the Talmud have many disputes, partly due to the lack of clarity that arose in their times because of external pressures, and partly because that is simply the nature of Torah. Again, Torah wanted there to be disputes. Look, please God, we're coming up to Pesach, the 4 questions. We're always supposed to be asking questions, seeking the answers. And of course, there's more than one valid path to a right answer. How did these disputes begin and what motivated them? We said that the disputes began because the students of Hillel and Shammai either did not serve their teachers well enough to understand all their teachings, or because they couldn't muster up as much intellectual prowess as them. And again, it comes to the time that they were living in. The pressures, the persecution, didn't have that intellectual capital or the time to be with their teachers. And again, for those who came late, it's not for one moment thinking about, are we going to use an etrog? No, that was always a given. It's about the minutiae, the small details of a particular mitzvah, of a particular belief, not the belief itself. These flaws came about due to external pressure exerted by the decrees of hostile Roman governments. The Talmudic debates were motivated by a drive for the truth, to know and perform God's will. The scope of these disputes was very narrow, focusing on minute details. Again, never about, is there I've given you so many examples already. Not about, do we have to say Shema, but what's the correct time? Not about, is it really the etrog that's taken with the lulav? Absolutely not. But when? It would be about, do we do it in the night? Do we do it in the day? When is that mitzvah observed? That would be an example of the minutiae. We spoke about how can more than one opinion in a dispute be right. So even when 2 sides of a Talmudic debate are mutually exclusive, they contradict each other, both can be right in the sense that both conclusions were drawn using the correct methodology, like Beit Hillel, like Beit Shammai. God taught Moshe more than one possible outcome on many halachic issues and left it to future generations to determine how to decide these issues, thus including even the halachically rejected and minority opinions as part of Torah. For practical reasons, only one side can be adopted as halacha, but the rejected opinion remains the words of the living God. Are all opinions equally valid? That was a question we asked. Doesn't mean that just anyone's opinions are valid in the Torah framework. The scope of halachic debates is very narrow, focusing on minute details of the application of Torah laws, and valid opinions can be offered only by those recognized as carriers of the tradition, masters of the word, whose knowledge and character give them such authority. Again, in a previous shiur, I mentioned the term a gaon, someone who had mastery of Shas, the whole of the Gemara. He had halacha at his fingertips. We're talking about that type of a rabbinic authority giving halachic decisions, not just your average rabbi. How do Torah scholars today decide amongst competing opinions? How is a layperson supposed to do this? So I'll end with this. Any competent halachic authority must approach his subject matter with his own eyes. At the same time, he must have the humility of knowing he's a midget standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's what, of course, all our halachic authorities do today. They have the humility to paskin laws, but they know, again, all the scriptural support I've given, that they need to use their own eyes. They need to be a judge in their own times. Matters have to be brought to them. They are the judge in our times. Just like Shmuel was a judge 100 years after Yiftach. Yiftach was higher. He was closer to the Sinai experience. Hope you've all enjoyed this series. I did have a few people, and I always appreciate constructive criticism. There were a few people who came on for the earlier 1 or 2, and they said it was a bit too advanced, and they therefore didn't come with the rest. So I absolutely understand that. I just wanted to give a bit more, we say lomdisha, a bit more learning into this. Future shiurim, I probably won't go into as much detail, but please God, next Monday, as I said, I want to go into Pesach. And again, I'm not going to go into the dry black and white halachic areas of Pesach and the Seder. That we, please God, doing between Mincha and Ma'ariv at Shul as best we can. But it's going to go into more about the background, the context for the Pesach, how Pesach is relevant to us in the year 2021, what it means to maybe experience as if we left Egypt. What does it mean today? So please God, I'll look at that for next Monday and the following Monday. Again, thank you for joining. Everyone have a good night.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.